This is Bob Gomez, and we are continuing in our study of the Gospel of John. We are beginning chapter 18 this morning. John chapter 18, verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the ravine of the Kidron, where there was a garden into which he himself entered, and his disciples. Now Judas also, who was betraying him, knew the place, for Jesus had often met there with his disciples. Judas then, having received the Roman cohort and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all the things that were coming upon him, went forth and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" They answered, "Jesus the Nazarene." He said to them, "I am he." And Judas also, who was betraying him, was standing with them. When therefore he said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again therefore he asked them, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus the Nazarene." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If therefore you seek me, let these go their way, that the word might be fulfilled which he spoke. Of those whom thou hast given me, I lost not one." Simon Peter, therefore, having a sword, drew it, and struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear. And the slave's name was Malchus. Jesus therefore said to Peter, "Put the sword into the sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it?" Okay, we'll stop there for now. Okay, recall that this is the last week of Jesus' life just before he was to be crucified. And they had left the upper room where they had the Passover, and Jesus had given them some private instructions, and then he had said his the prayer we have in John chapter 17, and Judas had gone on his way and had gotten the high priest, and he had already made arrangements to betray Jesus, and so he was on his way to the garden where he knew Jesus would be. Remember that this has only been about 5 days since Jesus rode into Jerusalem on the donkey, and the whole multitude had cried out, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And now it's only 5 days later when the whole multitude is going to be completely turned against him. So when Jesus had finished his prayer, he and the disciples go out of the upper room where they were, and they go out of Jerusalem, and they go across this little ravine which is on the east side of Jerusalem, and right across would be the Mount of Olives, where is this garden, the Garden of Gethsemane. This is where Jesus normally spent the night when he was in the vicinity of Jerusalem. Sometimes he went over to Bethany, which was just on the other side of the Mount of Olives, which was a few more miles away. But Jesus had spent the night here the last 2 or 3 nights. And so Judas had been with him, so Judas, of course, knew where Jesus would be. And so in verse 2 it says, "Now Judas also, who was betraying him, knew the place, for Jesus had often met there with his disciples." So we don't know anything about this place. It was probably an olive grove, and a garden combination of some sort, and it probably had a stone wall around it. And so Jesus and his disciples would go there and would meet there and frequently spend the night. In verse 3 then it says, Judas, having received the Roman cohort, and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. So Judas was probably leading this crowd, and with him out front would be Malchus, the one who Peter would later cut the ear of, and then there would also be the leader of this Roman cohort. So those three men would be out in front, and probably right behind them would be the group of Roman soldiers. We don't know exactly how many there were, but it probably would be a good number, 50 or maybe more, because they were always prepared for any contingency, and they didn't know if there would be any resistance when Jesus would be arrested, whether there would be a riot or anything. So the Romans always were well prepared, and they always had plenty of men to handle any situation. And then with them were officers from the chief priests. These would be the temple police. And notice the chief priests there is in plural, and this has caused a lot of confusion, because actually Caiaphas was the chief priest, but his father-in-law, Annas, although he had been chief priest before, he still used the title of chief priest, even though he was no longer chief priest. So that's why chief priest is in the plural there. And so a lot of times when you're reading, you have to try and figure out, well, who's it talking about? Is it talking about Annas, or is it talking about Caiaphas? But anyway, so there was at least two men who used the title of chief priests. And so the chief priests and the Pharisees, this would means that this would be the Sanhedrin, which would be the ruling group there in Jerusalem. There were always 71 members of the Sanhedrin. And so they come with lanterns, light the way, and to probably positively identify Jesus, and torches and weapons. So they were coming out as if they were going to arrest a real dangerous criminal. Now, John does not mention the kiss of Judas that he used to identify Jesus. So, anyway, probably the first thing that happened when Judas did arrive there at the garden was that he went forward and kissed Jesus, and that was the sign which would identify Jesus as the one that they were seeking. And so they came upon him, so Judas went forward, kissed Jesus, and then stepped back and joined the group that had come out with him. We could pick that up from the other Gospels. Now notice that Jesus was completely aware of everything that was happening. Jesus, therefore, knowing all the things that were coming upon him, went forth. So there wasn't anything that Jesus didn't know ahead of time. He knew that this was his hour, that this was the main reason that he had come into the world, that the Father had sent him into the world to die on the cross, and that this was going to be leading directly to that. And this was his ultimate humiliation would be now that he would be betrayed and put on trial and hung on the cross and so forth. This would be his ultimate humiliation, and then from here then he would go on to be glorified as he died, was buried, was raised from the grave, and then ascended up into heaven. So Jesus knew ahead of time everything that was going to happen to him. So nothing takes him by surprise. So verse 4, then Jesus, therefore, knowing all the things that were coming upon him, went forth and said to them, whom do you seek? Well, you can imagine that the mob that came out to take Jesus, they thought that they were in control, and but Jesus here is actually the one who's really in control of the whole situation. So he steps forward and he asks the question, whom do you seek? And so he is being very authoritative. And so it seems like the tables are turned here. Jesus is in control of the whole situation, not the Romans, not this mob that's coming out to arrest him. It's really Jesus who is in control. And they had received the orders to arrest Jesus of Nazareth, or Jesus the Nazarene. And so when he asked, whom do you seek, it's probably the leader of the Romans who answered, Jesus the Nazarene. And so then Jesus said, I am he. Notice that Judas also, who was betraying him, was standing with him. So after he had kissed Jesus and identified Jesus as the one that they were coming after, he stepped back and joined the group that he had led out with him. And so then, verse 6, when therefore he, Jesus, said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. Well, this, of course, includes everyone that had come out against him. They all, when he said, I am he, they all just went backwards and fell to the ground. It was, of course, it was a miraculous thing that happened, but it just showed that Jesus was not really going to be taken against his will, that Jesus was really in control, and that Jesus was, if, you know, when the Romans arrested him, it was not because they were able to overpower him, but it was because he had willingly allowed them to do it, to put him under arrest. And so he had the power to resist, he had the power to escape, but this was all according to God's plan, and this was the whole purpose for him to come into the world. But anyway, when he just identified himself, they all just fell to the ground. And it must have really shaken them up, but they don't seem to have been deterred at all, because after they get up, he asked them again, in verse 7, whom do you seek? And Jesus the Nazarene, they answered. And Jesus answered, I told you that I am he. And so Jesus now is in control, and so he gives them the order. Says, if therefore you seek me, let these go their way. So Jesus is telling the people who came out to arrest him to take him and to let his disciples go, not to arrest them. And he did that, verse 9, that the word might be fulfilled which he spoke, of those whom thou hast given me, I lost not one. Okay, well this is the second time that Jesus had referred to this prophecy that he would not lose any. He also had referred to it back in chapter 17, and in that instance he had said that he would not lose any as far as them losing their spiritual salvation. But now he's talking about their physical well-being. So when Jesus is caring for somebody, it includes both the spiritual and the physical aspects of their life. So here Jesus is watching out for their physical well-being. And so this was in fulfillment of that passage, of that prophecy. Now Simon Peter, therefore, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear. And the slave's name was Malchus. Okay, well, Peter, without thinking or without considering what the consequences would be, cut off the servant's right ear. Now, this Malchus was probably the most important servant or employee of the high priest. He wasn't just a lowly servant. And it said, notice that John knows his name. But immediately then, after Peter had cut off his ear, Jesus steps forward, tells Peter to put up his sword, and we know from the other Gospels that he heals the ear of Malchus. It's not mentioned in this passage, in the Gospel of John, but we do know that Peter healed him immediately. Jesus healed him immediately. And then we have these words at the end of verse 11 that are not in the other Gospels. Jesus says, "The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it?" Now, John does not have the part of the agony in the garden where Jesus goes and prays, "Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. But if not, nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done." Okay, but this is talking about the same thing, the cup, which the Father has given me. Okay, the cup then is symbolic of what Jesus was facing at this time. The cup, of course, would be the agony of the cross and of the trial and everything that he had to go through in order to die on the cross for us, that we might have eternal life. And this is what it's referring to. It's talking symbolically and using the same terminology except in a different way about the cup. Notice it's the cup which the Father has given to him. Okay, so it's the Father that's one that's given to him, and of course Jesus is not going to try and get out of drinking it if there was no other way. So this, of course, comes after Jesus had already prayed. And remember, he went and prayed 3 times. Each time he came back, he found his disciples sleeping and so forth. And so all that took place before Judas arrived with the mob. And although it's not in the Gospel of John, it's in the other Gospels. John, of course, supplements what the other Gospels contain. And the things that John puts in are more in line with what John's whole purpose in writing the gospel was. Remember that John's whole purpose in writing his gospel was that we might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing we might have life through his name. And so when John puts this statement of Christ in here that's not in any of the other gospels, notice that he says it's the Father which had given him the cup, and that he was going to drink it. And anyone who read the Gospel of John, who was familiar with the other Gospels, would know what he meant by the cup. So then Jesus surrenders to the mob that's come out after him. So let's read a little further then, starting in verse 12. "So the Roman cohort and the commander and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him and led him to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people. And Simon Peter was following Jesus, and so was another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest and entered with Jesus into the court of the high priest. but Peter was standing at the door outside. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the doorkeeper and brought in Peter. The slave girl, therefore, who kept the door, said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the slaves and the officers were standing there, having made a charcoal fire, for it was cold, and they were warming themselves, and Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. Okay, so if we think of the time here, it was probably very late at night, almost midnight, when Judas arrived with the mob at the garden. Because remember, Jesus had done a number of things already in the garden. You know, he had prayed and talked to his disciples. And so it must have been around midnight when he was arrested. And so they take him, and they take him to Annas. Now remember, Annas was the previous high priest, but he's still using the title. He's the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who is the high priest. So they take him first to Annas, and so they must get there around 1 o'clock in the morning, and immediately we can imagine that servants or messengers go out throughout the city to summon the 71 members of the Sanhedrin, and so that they can come in for the trial. So that might take a couple of hours. So during that couple of hours, from about 1 to about 3 o'clock in the morning, in the middle of the night now, Jesus is at the palace of Annas. And it's probably that Annas and Caiaphas lived in the same place. And this was a huge palace. It was square, and it had a kind of like a patio in the middle, and the outside walls were like the walls around a city. They were very strong, and then there would be a gate with a tunnel that goes through the building to the inside patio. So they take Jesus into this place where Annas is waiting for them. Okay, remember now, it says, verse 13, and they led him to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Okay, so they go to Annas, and there's also a note here about Caiaphas. Caiaphas, in verse 14, Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people. Okay, well, if you remember, that was back in John 11 when the scribes and the Pharisees and Sanhedrin, they were trying to figure out how they were going to arrest Jesus, and they were talking about putting him to death, and some had objected to that. Among those would be Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea had objected to the idea of putting Jesus to death and so forth. But Caiaphas had prophesied that it was necessary for one man to die for the whole nation instead of having the whole nation perish. Now, Caiaphas meant it in one way, that, yeah, if they put Jesus to death, then he wouldn't be causing any trouble, and the Romans wouldn't come and take away the scribes and the Pharisees' authority. But the Holy Spirit meant it in another way. The Holy Spirit meant it that one person would die for everybody's sins. And so we have the Holy Spirit inspiring Caiaphas to make this prophecy. And it came out, Caiaphas meant it in one way, but the Holy Spirit meant it in another way. And if you want to look that up, that's in John chapter 11, verse 50. So then we have the the interruption of what happens to Jesus, and now we would focus on Simon, on Simon Peter. Verse 15, and Simon Peter was following Jesus, and so was another disciple. So that must have been the Apostle John, the one who wrote the Gospel. John never mentions his own name in the Gospel. So whenever he wants to refer to himself, he uses some sort of an indirect method of referring to himself. Like here he says, there was another disciple. John would be referring to himself. Another place he said the disciple whom Jesus loved, so forth. So John never mentions himself in the Gospel that he wrote. So we have Peter and John then following. Now that disciple, meaning John, the one who wrote the Gospel, was known to the high priest. Now, we don't know how John knew the high priest. I'm not told that, but somehow John did know the high priest. He knew him fairly well. He knew that the name of the high priest's servant was Malchus, and he knew a number of details. And so John then, in the middle of verse 15 there, he was known to the high priest and entered with Jesus into the court of the high priest. So he was able to get past the guard that was guarding the door because the guard knew him. But Peter was not able to because the guard didn't know Peter. Verse 16, but Peter was standing at the door outside. Now remember, at the door, and then there's this tunnel that goes through the building and out to this intercourt, because the building is built in a square and there's a court in the middle. So there's this tunnel, and Peter was standing outside of the gate of that tunnel. So the other disciple, that means John, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the doorkeeper and brought in Peter. Okay, now this then now brings Peter into the inside of the building, into this courtyard, where Jesus and all the soldiers are. Whether the Roman soldiers probably didn't go in there. The Roman soldiers probably went on back to their barracks, but there would be the temple police and all the scribes and Pharisees who had gone out and arrested Jesus. And so now they're in this building here. Verse 17, and the slave girl, therefore, who kept the door, said to Peter, you are not also one of this man's disciples, are you? So somehow she was able to figure out that Peter was one of Jesus' disciples, and so she brings it up to him, but he denies it. He said, I am not. Verse 18, now the slaves and the officers were standing there, having made a charcoal fire, for it was cold, and they were warming themselves, and Peter was with them, standing and warming himself. Okay, so this is the first denial of Peter. Now, getting back to Jesus, who is also right there in the courtyard, he is now going to be put, it's kind of like a pre-trial, or I don't know exactly what kind of, what you would call it, but it was not part of the actual trial, but Annas was going to try and get some information out of Jesus that he could use against Jesus. And it was this whole trial is, as far as legality is concerned, everything practically would amount to a mistrial, because everything that they did was wrong. First place, they were not supposed to conduct trials in the middle of the night. But the scribes and Pharisees were so anxious to get rid of Jesus that they weren't going to be stopped just by some technicalities such as that. You know, it's illegal to have a trial at night. That's not going to stop them. They want to get Jesus. So notice in verse 19 it says the high priest. So we might ask, who is that? Annas or Caiaphas? Well, it's Annas. We know because Jesus was taken to Annas. Okay, so the high priest therefore questions Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. So Um, this is stuff that Annas probably knew very well. He didn't have to ask Jesus these questions, but he's trying to get Jesus to say something that he can use against him at the real trial, when Jesus is actually put on trial. And remember, all this time now, the messengers have gone out throughout the city, and they're bringing in the members of the Sanhedrin so that they can actually conduct the real trial. So Annas is just kind of filling in time, trying to get evidence, false evidence, against Jesus that they can use in the trial. So it's somewhere between about 1 and 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning now. Verse 20, Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together, and I So Jesus is telling him, kind of without actually saying it, but he's saying him that these questions you're asking me are totally improper. If you want to find out about what I'm teaching, go ask the people who heard me. There's thousands of them. I taught in synagogues. I taught in temples. You want to find out what I'm teaching? Go ask them. Don't ask me. It's totally improper for you to be asking me about what I taught. If you really want to get the evidence, because that's who you should be asking. So this is what Jesus is doing. He's pointing out how improper this whole procedure is. He says, I haven't done anything in secret. You might notice a few things that, more specifically, that Jesus said. He says, I have spoken openly to the world. Okay, now, if we just look at the time of Jesus and where he was, if it wasn't for Jesus, we probably would not even be aware there was such a place as Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria at that time in history. Jesus put them on the map, we might say. So even though he was speaking only to a small little group, yet the words that he spoke have been recorded and they've been proclaimed throughout the whole world. And so Jesus is speaking prophetically here. I spoke openly to the world. Even as he spoke, everything that he said has been spoken to the whole world. And he is saying how he didn't do anything in secret. In those days, there were a lot of secret religious groups. They called them mystery religions. And they had all kinds of secret procedures and secret ceremonies and everything. We have a few today, but not anything like the number that they had back then. So what Jesus is saying is everything he's done openly, he's done publicly, he's done nothing in secret. He's not conspiring to riot, or he's not doing anything politically. There's nothing that he's doing that they should treat him the way he is. In other words, everything they're doing is totally improper. So in verse 21 says, why do you question me? Question those who have heard what I spoke to them. Behold, these know what I said. So Jesus is saying, what you're doing is totally improper, totally illegal. If you really wanted to conduct a fair trial, a legal trial, you're going about it completely in the wrong way. Verse 22, and when he had said this, one of the officers standing by gave Jesus a blow, saying, is that the way you answer the high priest? The blow there is like an open hand slap right across the face. And it wasn't just a gentle slap either, it was probably with his full strength. And that, of course, also was totally illegal. But here was Jesus with his hands bound behind him, unable to even duck out of the way or, anything. And here he was being on trial, answering accusations against him, and then a soldier just comes up and gives him a blow. This, of course, was totally improper. And it doesn't indicate why he hit him. He doesn't say what Jesus had said or anything about him. He just says, "Is that the way you answer the high priest?" So Jesus responds, "If I had spoken wrongly, bear witness of the wrong. But if rightly, why do you strike me?" So here again, Jesus is pointing out how illegal and how improper this whole proceeding is. And notice that Annas, the one who was conducting the hearing, he doesn't even rebuke the soldier. So in other words, by not rebuking the soldier, he's more or less approving of what the soldier did to Jesus. So now, by this time, all the members of the Sanhedrin, or at least a quorum, had been gathered together. And so verse 24 says, "Annas therefore sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest." Now they're ready for the whole Sanhedrin to conduct their trial of Jesus. So this is probably around 3 o'clock in the morning now. And so then the focus turns once again to Peter. Now Peter was standing and warming himself. Verse 25. "They said therefore to him, 'You are not also one of his disciples, are you?' He denied it and said, 'I am not.' One of the slaves of the high priest, being a relative of the one whose ear Peter cut off, said, 'Did I not see you in the garden with him?' Peter therefore denied it again, and immediately a cock crowed." Okay, so this is the third denial. So John does not record the second denial of Peter. We can find those in the other Gospels. So John only has the first denial and the third denial. And so then it says, "And immediately the cock crowed." And that usually happens about 3 o'clock in the morning, or somewhere around there. So now as Jesus is walking out, in the other Gospels it says that when the cock crowed, Jesus looked over and saw Peter, and Peter then realized that he had denied Christ 3 times, and the cock had crowed. So then he goes out and he weeps bitterly and so forth. Okay, so these details then you get from the other Gospels. So now they're leading Jesus out through this tunnel, and just as Jesus is being led out, he sees Peter. Peter's just denied him, and the cock has crowed, and then this is where Jesus glances over and sees him. Okay, so they take Jesus out of the palace of Annas, and they take him over to the main assembly hall where the Sanhedrin meet. And then there is a trial before the Sanhedrin, which lasts from 4 to about 6 o'clock in the morning, and that also is not included in the Gospel of John. We can get that in the other Gospels. And then from Caiaphas, then they take Jesus to Pilate. And this happens real early in the morning, about 6 o'clock. So verse 28, then, we are at about 6 o'clock in the morning. Now this is not unusual. This is what is normal, because the Roman courts opened at sunrise, and they went from sunrise to sunset. And so this was normal procedure, and if ever there was going to be a trial, everybody would be ready at sunrise. And so, of course, Pilate was also ready. Verse 28. "And they led Jesus, therefore, from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early, about 6 in the morning. And they themselves did not enter into the praetorium," that is, the Jews didn't enter the praetorium. That's Pontius Pilate's place. where he conducts official business, in order that they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Okay, so the Jews went to the praetorium taking Jesus, but they didn't enter in. They waited on the outside. They wouldn't go in because they didn't want to be defiled, because it was the Passover. Now, this expression has caused a lot of confusion. Now, the Passover itself lasted one day, but the whole observance of it lasted a week, and there were a number of other meals that they ate. Now, Jesus had eaten the Passover the night before, and that was the actual Passover. So when it says here that the Jews would not go into praetorium because they didn't want to be defiled, so that they might eat the Passover, that's not talking about the actual Passover meal. That's talking about one of the other festival meals connected with the Passover, and that was the one held on Friday. So this has caused a lot of confusion about the date of the crucifixion and all this, because a lot of people don't understand this reference to Passover. This reference to eating the Passover does not mean the actual Passover meal, because that had already been eaten the night before. This was a different meal in the week of the Passover, which was eaten on Friday. Okay, so we are now on Friday. We call it Good Friday. So Pilate, therefore, went out to them. So he went from inside the praetorium to the outside where the Jews were waiting. And this is also usual, because the Romans, as they are noted for their legal system and their fairness and everything, they conducted trials wherever it was appropriate. And so since the Jews would not come in for the trial, Pilate set up his court outside the gate so that Jesus would have the benefit of being able to face his accusers and everything. So this was normal procedure for a Roman court. And so Pilate was actually a fairly good judge. We might dislike him for many other reasons, but he was a good judge. This is probably one of the reasons why he was appointed to be the governor there in Judea. So, verse 29, Pilate therefore went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" Okay, so he sets up court, gets everything ready, and Jesus is standing there, and he opens the court. Like they say, court is now in session. What's the accusation against this man? So everything is official, and everything is going to be done right now. So finally, we have some legal procedure that is actually going to be done right. So Pilate asked for the accusation to be brought, and Pilate expects that the accusation is going to be some sort of a criminal accusation. But the Jews, they didn't bring Jesus to trial because of he committed some crime. It was because such things as he had said that he was the Son of God, so they thought that he was blaspheming. He had violated the Sabbath and things like this. Well, Pontius Pilate would not in the least be concerned with any of these kind of crimes. These were crimes of their religion and so forth. And the Romans, they had a policy that they did not interfere in the religions of the countries that they had conquered. And so Pilate would not be in the least concerned about any of these kinds of accusations. And so in this trial before Caiaphas that John doesn't mention, that John skips over, but we find in the other Gospels, remember, they had asked Jesus if he was the Son of God and so forth, and he had said, "Yes, I am, and you will see me coming in clouds of glory," and so forth, in power. And right away they had rent their clothes, saying, "Blasphemy, what need have we more charges," and so forth. So they had condemned him to death. And so they expected Pontius Pilate to say, oh, you condemned him to death? Okay, so they expected Pontius Pilate just to sign the order to put him to death. But Pontius Pilate isn't going to have any of this because he is a good judge. In spite of, he may have many other faults, but one thing is he is a good judge. And so he's not just going to rubber stamp the conviction which the Sanhedrin had made against Jesus. They had condemned him to death there in the trial before Caiaphas. So at least in the beginning then, Pilate starts out pretty good. And so they don't answer his question directly. All they say is, well, if he was not an evildoer, we wouldn't have delivered him up to you. So they don't say, well, he's guilty of certain crimes. He just said, look, we already convicted him. You should take our word for it. Pilate isn't going to have anything to do with that. So since they don't have any accusation to bring against Jesus, Pilate turns them away. It says, Pilate therefore said to them, take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. They didn't have an accusation, so Pilate dismisses it, turns them away. So then the Jews say to him, we are not permitted to put anyone to death. Well, up to this point, Pilate didn't realize that they had already held a trial and condemned him to death. But now, when they say this, Pilate now realizes that they're being really sneaky, that they have already had a trial and condemned him to death, and that they're just using him, and they expect him to go along with it. Well, he's not going to have anything to do with that. So they said, we're not permitted to put anyone to death. So they had already condemned him to death. And said that the word of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die. Well, the Jews were not legally allowed to put anybody to death, but if there was ever a mob or a riot or anything like that, they could, they could kill anybody they wanted to by stoning him to death. Many occasions they tried to stone Jesus, but he escaped. So they weren't really sticking by the law, but the whole thing is that this was being controlled by God, and he was not going to die by being stoned to death. He was going to die by crucifixion. And in order to die by crucifixion, it had to be under Roman jurisdiction. So they had tried everything else. The Jews had tried everything else to try and kill Jesus, but was not able to kill him because his hour had not yet come. And so, therefore, when Pilate hears this, in verse 33, he enters again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus. Okay, so the Jews are outside the praetorium, and where Pontius Pilate had originally set up court. Now he takes Jesus inside, and at this point he takes custody of Jesus. So Jesus is no longer the Jews' prisoner, he is now a Roman prisoner. And now the Romans have custody of Jesus. And so now Pilate comes inside the praetorium where he normally conducts court. And he summoned Jesus, and so now Jesus is in front of the bench, as we would say, where Pilate ordinarily conducts his court. And so now Pilate questions him. There in the middle of verse 33, it says, are you the king of the Jews? So Jesus says, are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me? Okay, something that John again leaves out is that after verse 32, where the Jew says that we are not permitted to put anyone to death, then they come up with these false accusations against Jesus, and they accuse Jesus of trying to overthrow the Jewish nation, of telling the people not to pay taxes to the Romans, and that he was claiming to be a king. So they brought these three false accusations against Jesus. I forgot to mention that there in verse 32. But anyway, it's right there, and we get this in the other Gospels. And the main accusation then would be that Jesus was claiming to be a king. And so this, of course, forced Pilate to take the case, because if he was claiming to be a king, then he would somehow be having to work against the Romans and against the emperor and all that. So Pilate probably knew that these accusations were false, but he had to check them out. And so the Jews bring these three false accusations against Jesus. So then Pilate then takes custody of Jesus and takes him into the praetorium. And so then Pilate begins to question Jesus about these false accusations that the Jews have brought against him. And Pilate is probably fairly certain that these are all false accusations, because Pilate was on top of the situation there around, around the countryside, and he would have known if there was somebody who was trying to get a revolt or against Rome or anything like that. And he had probably had plenty of spies out there reporting on what Jesus was doing and everything, and he knew that Jesus wasn't doing anything like the Jews were accusing him of. But he had to check it out. And so he begins to question. The Jews had said he was a king, and Pilate says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now, so you see that there is a discrepancy here between what the Jews had accused him of being a king, and what Pilate says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" So now Jesus has to clarify for Pilate exactly what Pilate's question was, because if Pilate was really asking, "Are you the king of the Jews?" then he would in essence be saying, "Are you the Messiah?" Now, Jesus, of course, knew that Pilate wasn't thinking along those lines, but for the record, he had to make it clear that Pilate's question didn't have anything to do with him being the Messiah, but Pilate's question was based upon the false accusation that he was a king in the secular sense, not the Messiah. And so he has to, for the record, make this clear, because this is going to this is going to affect the way he will answer the question. Because if he was to say, "Are you a king?" who in the secular sense, then Jesus would say, "No, I am not a king in the secular sense, and I'm not trying to overthrow the Roman government or anything else." But if the question was, "Are you the king of the Jews?" in other words, "Are you the Messiah?" then Jesus would answer yes. See? And so depending on what exactly Pilate meant by the question, it would affect the way that Jesus answered. So here, Jesus asked him specifically, verse 34, Jesus answered, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me?" Okay, now notice that Pilate allows Jesus to answer this question because it's perfectly legitimate. Here is a prisoner in his own defense, clarifying the question and everything, and Pontius Pilate is giving him a fair trial. And so Pilate answers him and says, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you up to me. What have you done?" So in other words, Pilate makes it clear that he has in mind, are you a secular king, and are you going to be in some way trying to take over the citizens and become their king? Are you trying to take over territory away from the Romans and everything? So it's absolutely clear now that Pilate is thinking in terms of a secular king. He's not thinking in terms of Messiah. And so now Jesus answers his question on that basis. Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world." Okay, so now this should satisfy Pontius Pilate, because what Jesus is saying is not saying that I am not at some time ever going to rule over the world, because we know that he is. One day God is going to rule the world, and God is king of the world. But what he means is, at that particular time, he was not building his kingdom, because right at that particular time he was going to the cross. And so he said, what he was saying is the origin or the base of my kingdom is not this world. In other words, his kingdom is in heaven. As we pray in the Lord's Prayer, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." The kingdom at this time is in heaven, but it will someday be on earth. And so Jesus is clarifying that. And says, "If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting. And that I might not be delivered up to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." Okay, so Jesus says, look at the evidence. If I had a kingdom and I was trying to overthrow the government and set myself up as king, I would have servants who would be out here with all kind of armies and weapons and everything, trying to protect me and trying to keep me from being arrested. Where's the evidence? See? The accusations which the Jews have brought against me are totally false. I am not trying to set up my own kingdom. Where are my soldiers? Where are the people who are defending me, if such was the case? And so Pilate therefore said to him, "So you are a king." Well, Pilate was satisfied with his answer that he was not a king in the secular sense, but his curiosity then was brought out and says, "Well, then in what sense are you a king? Are you a king?" And verse 37, Pilate therefore said to him, "Are you a king then?" Jesus answered, "You say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." And Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" Okay, so now Jesus is giving a complete answer to Pilate, that his kingdom was not of this world, but that he was a king. And this is the reason he was born, and this is the reason he had come into the world. Okay, so we'll pick up here next time.